afternoon, everyone. Again, my name's Ben Burge, and I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to thank the Performance Institute for allowing me to moderate this panel as we discuss the important topic of communicating performance metrics to our various stakeholder groups. We'll be looking at how we communicate with our stakeholders, which could be anyone from a neighborhood community to a governor or cabinet secretary at the federal level, any variety of groups. We have our panel of Michelle, Jason, and John, who represent local, state, and federal government, and they'll share their insights on this important topic. I think this is a great topic because this is something that I've lived in a previous job. And I know a lot of us in this field who have been communicating the importance of performance results to our bosses, our stakeholders. Initially, we've all seen those nodding heads of how great it sounds. And then a year or two later, we get a couple of them going, okay, what is it you do again for a living? And it's an interesting dynamic in between. So we're going to be talking about that quite a bit and how we communicate that and the importance of it. Why don't we just kick it off with our first question that I'm going to send out to the panel, which is, when presenting performance data to your various stakeholder groups, what are the important things you need to know about the audience? Since I did this for a living in local government, I am going to show local government bias, and I am going to ask Michelle if she would be the first one to respond to that question.
Thank you, Ben. Absolutely. I think one of the most important things to do is really understand who your audience is. And I'm not talking about whether they're public, stakeholders, or elected officials. I'm looking more at the different groups within that. Often you have a data wizard who's really into data and really understands it and really wants to know a lot about that. You need to communicate with that person differently than someone who is, say, a namesayer, who doesn't really like what you have to say, who doesn't believe any of your information. And you need to be able to be prepared for that type of person as well. You also have the true believer who just believes everything you say, and no matter what it is, they're going to back you and believe in this cause that you're trying to do your performance measures on. And the journalist who's going to question every single fact that you happen to deliver. You have the general public who is really more interested in the overall picture and just wants to know how it's going to impact them. And then the supporter who, no matter what, they're going to support what you're doing and what your cause and what your mission are. And I think an important thing is to understand how you're going to communicate with each one of those groups, because they each require something a little different.
Thanks. Completely agree. I mean, those groups are all very different and require a different set of handholding. John, I want to kind of follow up with you on that. You're often dealing one-on-one with governors and high-level state officials more directly. How would you compare that with what Michelle's talking about, working with different groups, but also, in the context of knowing your audience as a whole?
Well, yeah, and it's quite different from Michelle's experience in that the measures being presented are measures that were developed by those people. So the governor and the governor's cabinets in the more results-driven kinds of states, those measures are created by them. So they actually define them, and they work with people like Michelle to really carefully define them, be able to source them and make sure they're accurate and reliable. But they're measures they know, so you don't have to persuade them that these are measures that should be important to you. They already know that because they are the measures they determine are actually the gauges they're monitoring how effective they're being in managing the state.
Well, I don't know if he meant to, but Michelle, John just made your job sound a lot harder than his.
Well, it can be definitely challenging because each one of those groups is looking at the data from a different perspective, and you really have to understand their perspective in order to communicate with them and be able to handle maybe their objections, or make sure you get the right level of detail, because each one of those groups wants a different level of detail.
Yeah. And we really challenge the credibility of it in different ways, right? You know, that's a big issue. Data is only as real and usable as it is credible.
So Jason, we have Michelle talking about the complexities of all these different groups. John dealing with groups and individuals who are already immersed in the data and understand it. So at the federal level, what do you see in terms of communicating this, the importance and the relevance of the performance results?
Mm-hmm. I think from our perspective, we have very sophisticated, broad-based groups at the federal level, which makes it unique. So I'm at this U.S. Small Business Administration. We have various associations that we work with that support small businesses, as well as our stakeholders, including Congress, the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the general public. And I think to Michelle's point, that stood out to me was you certainly have to tailor information and to different audiences. I think that's a key thing for any level of government. From a performance management standpoint, the first thing that we do from a strategic planning perspective is really outline and define who our audience and stakeholders are. And I think that's really important, because the strategic planning framework sets the ideals for how we're going to develop our goals and measures for the organization, which will then determine how we assess our programs. And I think that's really the key point, is we're working towards our broader objectives of program and performance management to ensure that we're delivering outcomes for the people, the taxpayers. And so when we're focusing on either developing metrics or pushing out performance data, it's understanding what their needs are and how they're going to be using that data to inform their decisions. And we want to make sure we get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, John, in addition to knowing the audience and what the audience needs and the different types of audiences, what other things need to be considered when we're communicating these performance results?
Well, a lot of I'd love to hear what Michelle and Jason think about this, but a lot of the communication is about credibility. And it's understanding that we know our business and that we're managing it well. Because measuring things but not improving them doesn't serve a great purpose. And so what I've experienced is when agency leaders are able to go to the legislature and demonstrate that we actually know what's going on. We have the measures. We're actually picking measures and improving them. And we're telling you about things we're having trouble with, that we can't improve, that we need investment dollars, or we need new ways of doing things. And so the power of these measures is in their ability to focus us on things that matter, and in our ability to establish credibility. In state government, the executive branch often loses control, and the legislative branch takes over because the executive branch can't demonstrate through their measures that they're actually running the place. And so in the absence of that, they get tampered. A lot of
Jason, what other things do you have to consider when you're looking at communicating these results, other than the audience?
Yeah, I think it goes back to John's point about, what progress are you making for these programs? And one of the things we do at the SBA every year is we go through an annual review of our measures to determine whether they are tracking the right things. And I think it's good from the standpoint of making sure that the metrics tie into administration priorities. I think that's relevant. There's the nice thing I would say about SBA is we are a fairly bipartisan agency. So policies tend to be pretty stable across administrations, but there does tend to be some changes in focus. So we will adjust our measures based on priorities of leadership. And then I think the measures themselves need to change over time too, depending upon where you're at in the evolution of a program. I think from the standpoint of some of our programs have been around for 50 or 60 years. And some of our programs are new. They've been around for 2 or 3 years, and so the information you communicate from those programs varies depending upon the maturity of those programs. And so from our newer programs, there's sometimes more contextual indicators. We're starting to baseline information, and then for some of our older programs, we're looking at more of the efficiency type metrics. Sometimes it's more customer experience related, depending upon how long services have been provided. So, but I think sometimes the measures speak to where the program is in its evolution, and that I think oftentimes does tie into not only the leadership priorities, but also the needs of the stakeholders outside as well.
So, Michelle, I'm going to guess that working at the local level, you run into a whole bunch of other things that state and local folks don't. I'm basing that on my experience. What types of things do you see that are important on this? Again, outside of understanding the audience.
Well, I think another key component is how you're communicating the information. Not just what are you communicating, but how are you going to be communicating it? Are you going to have someone who is standing in front of a press conference? We do, unfortunately, a lot of information sharing through our media. And so we have to look at, is the information we're delivering being delivered by someone who understands it, who can field questions, who then has the ability to communicate well? Because if you're communicating a message and the message gets lost because they have poor English, or they have they use a lot of ums and ers and and well, I don't know about that, and ooh, you lose what's actually being said. And so I think looking at how you do that communication, if you're using PowerPoint, what does your presentation actually look like? And making sure that the message that you're wanting to deliver is being received, because we all know that it's easy to give information, but not as easy to receive it. And so making sure that you have someone who's able to ensure that the audience is understanding what they're saying. And now in Zoom, that's really hard, because you're not there at a press conference looking at people in the eye and seeing them nod at you, or seeing, yes, I get that. Or you're getting their, well, I completely disagree with that. And you're not able to read their body language. And so I think in this new world of Zoom and doing so many of our communications not in person and not in a form that we're used to doing them in, the message can get lost. And I think that's really an important piece to look at. So not only do you need to look at what you're communicating, but how you're doing that communication. If you're looking at a written report, what does your measures look like in space? Do they have enough ink to white page ratio? Are you using words and numbers and drawings together to paint a picture? Or if you're doing a written report, are you really making someone go to figure 13 on page 28 when they're reading information that's on page 3? Those are things that I don't think people really typically think about when they're thinking about communicating performance, and they make a big difference in how your data is being received. And so from my perspective, that's one of the things that we look at. We spend a lot of time not just on what the numbers say, but how are we going to deliver that message so that it's understood by the people that we're trying to make understand our performance.
That's a really interesting and good point. Makes me think of so I'm going to throw a follow-up question out to whoever wants to grab it first. But on that note, when you are communicating, are there protocols? Should there be protocols? How have you dealt with these protocols on how things are communicated? Do you work with a communications office? Do you have somebody who proves it? Do you go through these processes to make sure your audience understands? And is there a feedback loop? Any thoughts on that?
For us, go ahead.
I think
John.
Michelle looks like she lives in this dimension.
We have a communications officer that deals with a lot of our communication. And one of the things that we're really working to implement now, especially working with the police department, which is the department that I'm spending most of my time with currently, is making sure that we're getting the data from the same source. Because not only do you have to worry about what's being communicated and how it's being communicated, but how are they able to actually defend the data? Are they able to talk about where that data came from, the uniqueness of that information? You know, many people understand the term garbage in, garbage out, but do they really understand what that means in communicating performance? And so those are things that we're working on at the city of Albuquerque. And that's really making sure that who's doing the communication is getting the information from the same source that the last person did the communication with, and that our numbers have a reasonability to them, and that we're not all of a sudden saying we have a 42% drop in crime, because, you know, that's probably not true. And so you really need to be looking at the information before you present it and ensuring that you understand where that information came from and that you're all talking the same story.
And I would add to it, I imagine that you've experienced this, Michelle, where as you start to gather the data, you discover when you look at two locations or districts or whatever, and the data is so different.
Mm-hmm.
And you probe it, and then you discover that their working definitions are different.
Right, exactly.
And so the data may be perfectly accurate, but there's a fundamental flaw. And so it takes time to shake all that out and standardize the definitions. And I know that I've seen it in corrections where, you know, the inmate on staff assaults were defined differently in locations. And when you do that, you get very skewed results. And you can have one institution look like it's horrifically violent, when in reality, they count someone, you know, touching the staff person as an assault, where the other, it has to be, you know, some sort of bodily injury verified by a medical professional. Well, you're going to get very different results.
Right.
Mhm.
We had that very case with arrests. We had 4 different definitions currently that we've been able to define as what an arrest means. And it depends upon who the audience is. An arrest for one person who's dealing with the FBI, they have a very stringent definition of what an arrest is. But when you're talking with someone who's dealing with, say, a case settlement where the judge has said, this is what an arrest is, that may not be the same as the FBI definition. And so that's definitely one of the things that we've had to look at is when we're communicating information, are we really using the same terms and therefore the same logic, or do we need to explain that if you're comparing the FBI information to the information for this specific case, it's going to be different because the definitions are different. And that's at a core to where we're having challenges communicating our information with the public at the moment. And as we began to become more knowledgeable about our information, and whether it's in a final state or if it's in an investigative state, your numbers are different there as well. So really understanding what you're communicating and why you're communicating it plays a big role.
That's a real problem. I remember once when I was with a group of performance data professionals from the region, and we thought, hey, let's compare our 911 response rates. And we couldn't agree, this room full of us, when the clock started. And so we gave up. Jason, the assumption that the federal government is this monolithic sort of, you know, this Borg-like creature where definitions are understood amongst each other, but not outside of the federal government, and it's disjointed between the states. I'm sure in an organization that large, it's not the case. What, especially with NBA, where you have not only a large organization within a large department, but a lot of state affiliations and communications on data, what kind of challenges does that face in terms of performance communication?
Yeah, no, it's we have many of the same challenges that that state and local folks have as well. So yeah, I think from our standpoint, definitions are key. And I was just going to respond to Michelle's comment that we spend a lot of time really thinking about definitions of what counts, what doesn't count. From the standpoint of the SBA, we have a lot of different counseling and training programs. And what does it mean to counsel someone? What does it mean to train somebody? And for us, one of the things that I think in terms of a best practice is we have developed data quality records for every measure so that we have defined really everything that goes into the metric, what the definitions are, how it's measured, methodology, so that if someone from the public does come back and asks us, what does this mean? We can easily refer to it. And there's essentially a record that says that this is here. I think that's useful also from the standpoint of grantees. If you're delivering a grant program across your state, across your local governments, and you want to ensure that information is measured consistently, that you have those terms and definitions clear for everybody. I think that's really important. And from our standpoint, it makes a big difference in terms of the quality of data that you get back. Because again, if you're trying to use data and measures to make decisions and to inform actions, the quality of those decisions is only as good as the data that comes into the system. So I think it's important to ensure that everybody's on the same page from that communication standpoint.
Yeah, I would add if I
yes,
that it would be really to dig deep enough into federal versus state versus city. But I'm going to make a guess, and Jason and Michelle, if you'd react to this. So the federal government has a pretty growingly mature system of measurement, program evaluation that's ubiquitous. More of you use it. Where if you went into cities, that's the other extreme. They range from, absolutely no consistency and no measures, to efforts like the ones you're involved in it's Albuquerque.
Right.
Albuquerque. Yeah, where there is an effort and there's professionals working on it, to states which I always find the fact that we have 50 experiments for democracy, how they're all measuring differently, and they're all repeating the same learn. Because if you sit down with governors and you ask them what their goals are, and you work with their cabinets to create measures, they all have the same ones. It's just they're a different priority what they want to work on, but they're the same. They're identical. And so it'd be wonderful if states could create a greater consistency of measures and share that with each other, create standards, same with cities, because as we've learned in the pandemic, not having common data slows us down when we really need to move fast.
Right.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And that kind of leads to my next question, which is, in addition to defining these terms and defining what it is we mean when when we're asking for things either through a form or collecting data, how does the analysis of the data, how is that impacted by your audience? Like, what are you considering when analyzing the data prior to communicating it? What are the things that you think of? What are the things that are important in this this process of doing the analysis? John, let's start with you in terms of I know you talk about a lot of the metrics are the same, but what are some of the different analytic processes that you see that different states might want to undertake when they're communicating it?
It's a really good question. Here's the challenge in states, and it might surprise you or not. Their level of relative maturity, in this dimension of measurement is pretty low, in part because every 8 years they empty the bathtub and the new governor jumps in and start filling it back up again. And so they lose a lot of what was learned. And so most of what states are doing is trying to establish some basic performance dimensions for up and down the organization, which is a super complex thing to do when you look at. I always say, you know, what's the measure of success in business? And people always say it's profit. And then I ask the question, what's the measure of success in government? And people laugh and chuckle, and somebody will yell, "Get reelected," and everybody laughs. And then I'll add, well, the reason you can't answer the question is probably in a state 100 measures equivalent to profitability. It's the level of complexity that is so much greater than in business that the kinds of techniques used to manage business are desperately needed in government far more than in business. So I think that's part of the challenge, honestly, Ben, is I don't think the maturity is there until you get into the deep domains, until you get into corrections or into youth and you get into, you know, the domains health where there's lots of research done. Most of the performance data is really kind of emerging in a bit rudimentary.
Jason, is that similar to how you see it at the federal level? Or at least with SBA, I should say. I don't want you to account for every federal agency.
Yeah, I mean, I really think John hit it there. He really hit at the point that there is that complexity to it. When you think about profit, it's easy to measure profit across businesses as dollars, right? When you think about measuring outcomes for, take small business programs. I mean, a lot of times it's jobs, and how do you measure a job? And you can measure it a million different ways, and every agency is going to do that differently, and the outcomes associated with our agency are different than the outcomes associated with another agency, an environmental agency or a health agency or a housing agency. So, I think it makes it's much more complex. And I think it's also much more difficult to communicate that complexity because it is so different. But I think from the standpoint of maturity, I think the nice thing about the federal government is that all federal agencies have a standard framework to work from. We all have obviously the GPRA, the Modernization Act, the Evidence Act. We all have to follow guidelines set by the Office of Management and Budget. So there is that consistency to ensure we are on the same page. But even with federal agencies, I would still say that there's quite a bit of variation across agencies and across programs. I mean, think about all the thousands of federal programs that are out there. There's levels of maturity within those, depending upon the newness of the programs that I mentioned earlier. I think also the research within programs is particularly important. John made a really good point about, there's some areas that are studied more heavily than others. And I think within those areas, particularly the health programs and justice programs, I think you get a lot more research there, well-developed research. And so you have a lot more complex measures, whereas other programs, you don't necessarily have that level of maturity, which makes it a little bit more challenging, I think, to really define what your outcomes are.
Michelle?
For me, I think we have a wide variety of data maturity across the city. We have some that are very knowledgeable of what they do, how they measure it, and how they're going to use data. And then we have other departments that don't even realize that they have data that they could use to make decisions with. And so we have a wide variety of how do you communicate with each of those departments, looking at creating standard dashboards and to gather information for the mayor, and for us, our mayor changes every 4 to 6 years. So depending upon what it is that you're really after, it takes a year to figure out what that mayor is looking for and how to communicate that information. But then you have the aspect of the citizen. because our citizens don't change and they want to know how their dollars are being spent, how their programs are being managed, and they want to understand that data at a completely different level. So in some cases, our data maturity within our citizens is higher than our data maturity within the city. And the program that I'm working with right now, we're just starting to understand how putting data into the system, how it gets managed while it's moving through the various systems, and then how it comes out at the end and where we're doing our performance to show that we're improving how we're handling use of force cases, or how we're handling the amount of arrests that we have in relationship to the mentally, I just lost the terminology that we use, the behavioral health world. Those are all measured differently and have been measured differently over the years, but we're starting to really understand that now. So at the city of Albuquerque, our data maturity level is definitely improved. And we've been able to, with the police department, have a better understanding of cause and effect. How you gather your information really impacts how the results look, and having a care about the quality of data that goes in versus the quality of data that comes out, that relationship is really starting to be understood a lot better. I've been at the city coming up on 14 years with 3 different mayors. And when I first got to the city, it was, oh, we make all of our decisions based on our gut and what our gut tells us. And we don't look at data. Data's not that important. To now, as we have a younger mayor who's really into understanding data and what data can do for you, having that be more of an emphasis. And not only do you need to know that you have data, but you need to be able to tell me what that data means and how I can use that to measure your performance, because I'm not going to just take your word that you're doing a good job. I want to see that you're doing a good job. And so the data maturity has really changed over the years at the city of Albuquerque. And it's really been exciting to see how that change has impacted how we communicate with our citizens and the different people and the different groups that we have within the city that care about what's happening.
That's a really good segue to a question we received from in the chat room, which is, how do you balance your internal and external perspectives on communicating performance results? So I know that from my experience, internal and external could have been within the county executive's office, and external could be the agencies. Internal could be the government, and external could be the public, and internal could be my team, and external be the county executive's office. There are all different kinds of ways. I'm guessing, though, that for the purposes of this discussion, that the spirit of the question is probably more government and public, or government media, government, other stakeholder, external stakeholder groups. So how do you balance those when you're trying to communicate the relevance and importance of performance results? Don, what do you think?
Yeah, so it's an interesting challenge, and I hadn't thought about this until we got into this conversation, but I'm gonna show a picture. And the reason I'm gonna show this picture is it's a governor's map of how he wants to run the state. And what I ask you as you look at it is, if every agency had an equivalent, some sort of tool that they were able to present internally and externally that said, here's who we are, here's what we're doing, here's what we're measuring, and everybody used that same tool, we build a language. When we have a language, we can communicate. And when we can communicate, we can collaborate. And so I'm a real believer in creating structures and logic that people get. So I'll show you this, and there's versions of this that are, let me see. There's versions of this that go down to a department or even a team. So this is called, can you see it? It's called a governor's map. And so what it has on it is, this is the governor of Arizona. These are his mission, I won't talk about his shared vision, but values, core beliefs, and then the key goals. If you read the banner at the left, and those are his goals. And then down at the bottom are his mission measures, which are outcome measures. Those are how he's measuring whether those goals are being achieved. And then in the middle are the core processes, which really bring all the agencies together under the bodies of work and their process measures. Now, this isn't perfect, but the cabinet created it. And so they believe in it, they understand it, they originated it. And sure, it can get better as years go by, but then you do the same at the agency level and you do the same at the team level. You simplify the tool set, but they're all using the same language, the same logic. And what it does is it facilitates whether you're communicating internally or externally, you start at the same place. And you always start there. And I have found that this has been a remarkable tool to be able to advance comprehension and connection.
And Michelle, how do you see this? These
Well,
not competing, but existing perspectives.
I think one of the things that we do well at the city of Albuquerque is meeting with our citizens and having honest and frank conversations with them about our data, what it means, where we're moving towards the goals that we have, and helping them to understand where we're at, because we are not 100% at the highest level of maturity that you could be with data in the city. And having those open and honest discussions with them, and then hearing what they're talking about, hearing the questions that they're answering, allows you then the next time we meet to communicate a little bit more with them on the issues that they're concerned with and how they fit into what our overall performance measures are. And so I think that's a key thing that you need to do, is really make sure that you understand what each of your audiences is really looking for. Because what I need internally to be able to determine, what we're going to do with how many officers we have at a specific location, or what our shift looks like and how many people we have on the various shifts at the various locations, is one way that we use data internally within the city of Albuquerque. But another way that we use the data is measuring our performance towards, say, what our citizens are expecting and what our citizen policing groups are looking at, and the information that they want to see to know if we're making progress on the promises that we've made to our citizens. And so I think really understanding how the two different groups are using the data and what they're using that data for is really key. And at the citizen external level, the way to get to that is really having conversations with your citizens so that you really know what they're after and what matters to them and how it matters to their lives and their perspectives on life.
And Jason, how do you see this, these different perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it ultimately goes back to your strategic plan. Do you have a strategic plan and for your organization that really defines what those broader goals and objectives are? Because I think that from the federal level, we're maybe a little unique in the sense that most of our programs are at least defined in legislation what certain outcomes should be. One thing that kind of popped in my head was really thinking about what tools that different stakeholders use, and our products and tools that we develop for either internal or external stakeholders will vary based on those needs. I would say from the external standpoint, it tends to be more summary level. The measures have been defined for a considerable period of time. I think sometimes from the more internal, sometimes it's more focused on the operations piece about how a program is running from an efficiency standpoint more so. I think the other point I'd want to make is that from a communication standpoint, it needs to be iterative. I think Michelle made a really good point about ensuring that you're engaging with your stakeholders and getting feedback and then modifying based on that feedback. Oftentimes we will develop something in-house or for an external audience that we'll then seek feedback on over time. And then again, those priorities measures will change based on obviously the needs of our stakeholders outside, leadership priorities, et cetera. So I think it's being flexible and resilient based on those changing priorities.
One of the issues that I know I encountered is when we are, whether it's developing performance metrics or publishing or putting online performance metrics, who's in charge? Who's the party responsible for setting that agenda, whether it's the public facing or just internally? And have you encountered any best or worst models for ensuring the best information is getting out there? Jason, you work in an environment I'm the least familiar with, and as a result, I'm the most intrigued to hear what your answer is.
I don't feel like my answer the best though. I think from our standpoint, and I think this would be probably applicable to any level of government, is, it has to come from the top. I think the whomever the executive is, whomever the chief operating officer is, I think those are the individuals that have to buy in to the measures and data and understand their purpose and use, to really drive the ship in terms of where we're going to go. I think from our standpoint, we have not only great leadership that helps us provide that direction, but also we have a very technically savvy team. I think that's the other component too, that understands how to shape and develop measures based on the needs of leadership. And I think part of that, from the standpoint of at least the legislation we have very defined roles of individuals that are supposed to guide agencies through that process, whether it be the performance improvement officer, the evaluation officer, the chief data officer, the chief operating officer. I think those roles are fairly defined within legislation, so that we as those individuals can make that determination of what gets published and how to really drive the direction for measures and data. And so I think there is at least that maturity within the federal agencies.
Michelle, what landmines do you have to navigate, or roadblocks do you have to plow through?
Well, I think being at the city level, we are very close to our citizens, and so they drive a lot about what it is that we have to report, how we report it, what they're interested in. And unfortunately, you sometimes find yourself when you have a court settlement where you're required to show performance measures and show that you are changing your behaviors based on whatever the court case might be. And so our measures come from many different places. We have the measures that the mayor at the time wants to have us be judged against. We also, though, have the things that the courts might have us require us to be judged against, and what our citizens want to see as well. And so we have a little bit more of a complexity of where that direction comes from. It's not always something we get to set. Sometimes it's imposed on us. And that's just a challenge that we have to understand and be able to hit head on. Right now, that's where I'm at, is learning how we are going to be able to get from being in a case, court-ordered settlement, to being self-monitored. And how are we going to be able to move from being told how we're doing and what we're doing to being able to tell our citizens how we're doing and what we're doing and have them believe us. And so there's a lot of differences, and especially compared to the federal level, where ours can change if we have one lawsuit that gets put against the city of Albuquerque and we have some settlement that we are now forced to measure against.
And John, when you're working with governors, chief executives, or chief of staff, that are they willing to be that person?
You can drive to a certain degree. You could drive it within an agency. You could drive it down in the sub part of an agency. But where the real power comes is when the governor says, this is important. And what the most progressive states are doing now is they are adding the position of chief operating officer. Traditionally, it has been chief of staff, and the chief of staff is really the governor's political right hand. But somebody needs to have the lens of operating the state in their purview. It's a different set of skills. It's a massive amount of work. And when the governor says to the CEO, go get this done, it gets done. And so I think it is far more powerful when the governor decides that it's important.
I would be interested from any of our panelists, how much of the performance results that they produce or that they advise people to produce are generated from the public. Michelle, you brought this up about how the public is highly involved in this. I know that in my previous positions, we've taken input like that from citizens, but how much of it does come from the outside, and how much of it should? And this is an open question to the panel, or I'll pick on someone.
Well, I'll start because I have a fairly short answer.
Okay.
You may doubt that, but my answer is the problem with starting to open to the public is the inability to adequately respond. And it's a setup for disappointment. Learn to walk, do it inside in the privacy of your own Capitol or whatever it is, City Hall. Get so you can do it and then start talking to the people who really do matter. You can get a lot of good stuff done without a ton of external influence, but ultimately you have to go external.
Yeah, to hit on that too, I think that it would be nice if there was more input from external stakeholders. I think that would help with greater accountability of programs. I think sometimes, at least from the federal level, we have a much more difficult time, I think, sometimes connecting down to the citizen level. And sometimes I'm envious at the folks at the city level because they do have more of that direct line. Not to say we don't, but I think from our standpoint, we have so many different groups that, is trying to bend to different audiences. But I think that external stakeholder input is very valuable in terms of the process to really help you think about what you're going to measure and how you're going to use that data to drive decisions.
And I think it's a balance. I think you need to have both. You need to have measures that are set to ensure that the city is operational in the way that it needs to be run, and that it's meeting expectations for the mayor and what his goals are for the city, because each mayor does have different goals for the city. But overall, the citizens are the ones that are the constant. And so making sure that you're listening to them and hearing what they have to say and taking that into account when you're setting your performance measures. And I think that's really key, is finding that balance between the two. Because for me, from the data perspective, the citizen is who pays my payroll. That's if they're not happy, then they're not happy. So we need to make sure that you're doing that balance and keeping both your management happy and the citizens that you serve happy.
And do you feel, and this could come from a citizen perspective that you may have heard, Michelle, or it could come from higher up, Jason. Do you feel that the establishment of the performance metrics are being communicated effectively in a way that you feel that the leadership feels it's worth it? Do they feel it's been a worthwhile investment? I'll start with John.
Yes. I'm watching the clock type down to 0. So yeah, I think people believe that these kinds of things are worth the investment.
Okay, I'm seeing nodding. In addition to seeing nodding heads from Jason and Michelle, I'm also getting my cue to wrap up. So again, I want to thank this team, this panel. I appreciate your time. Having been someone who managed a stat office in one county and then created one in a bordering county, two completely different cultures, two completely different sets of demands, two completely different sets of data that they wanted us to look at. I think it's really important to understand all these different perspectives, all these different demands and these pushes and pulls and communication strategies and everything we have to take into consideration. So thank you once again for your time. And thank you once again to PI for letting us have this time. And thank you to the audience for your participation. Appreciate the great question we were able to field. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Good job, Ben.